Cormac McCarthy fans, today I'm going to be walking you guys through how Cormac McCarthy wrote and created his characters. And this, of course, is a very hard venture because McCarthy was very tight lipped about his writing process and literature in general. But I have spent a bunch of time at the Cormac McCarthy archive and also made over 100 videos here. So today I'm going to tell you guys what I have figured out. And McCarthy loves to pump up his own mysteriousness and I think shield himself from further questions by saying, all my writing is unconscious. I don't plot anything. And today, after I show you guys a step by step process of how McCarthy writes his characters, you will see that that is untrue. So, McCarthy's characters, most of the time, are either historically inspired or based on people that he knows. And that is a very conscious process. So when we examine Outer Dark, which is a perfect example, this all becomes very apparent. So McCarthy's first step to creating characters is finding interesting historical figures or people that he knows to write about. And on December 15th, 1962, McCarthy started writing Outer Dark. But this was the same month where his wife was starting to divorce him and starting to plan that she was going to take their newborn child and move to Wyoming. And this, I'm sure, created a lot of tumultuous stress and started to help McCarthy manifest his inner Eraserhead energy. And so he decided to write a novel about a brother and sister living in a cabin who have an incestuous baby. And the brother doesn't want to have the kid anymore, so he goes and throws the baby in the woods. And then the ensuing novel is about separation, guilt, and all these other nightmarish things. Where do you think McCarthy got this idea from? Well, we know where he got the idea from because we have McCarthy's first draft of Outer Dark, and I've read it, and it's obviously a story about him and his first wife and all the guilt he has around that. And then he, turned that in to an actual novel. But when you read the first draft of Outer Dark, there are two distinct things. One being the triune does not exist, and the second that the characters are much more emotional. It's almost like McCarthy is doing like journal writing. He's like working through his problems and like exploring these things with his characters. And that is step number 2 of McCarthy's writing process, and he follows this in almost every single novel. I've read almost all the early drafts of all the novels except The Passenger. I'm going to be doing that soon. And so what McCarthy does is he writes about his characters in a very loose way and provides actually a lot of details about their past and provides a decent amount of interiority about their feelings and thoughts about what is going on. And this may seem like a stark contrast because in the later drafts, which is step number 3, McCarthy removes those feelings and creates timeline issues or gaps in their past. And this minimalism is very interesting because McCarthy balances this out. He doesn't just remove this, but he usually adds something in to replace it. And what replaces this time and time again are supernatural elements in his stories. So for instance, when you look at Outer Dark, if you got I'm not going to spoil really anything if you guys haven't read it, but there is something called the Triune, and it's these 3 guys, and at the start of the novel they are literally nightmarish creatures existing in, you could say, spirit, but later in the novel they literally walk out of a mural into corporal reality. But this triune didn't get added until the 4th or 5th draft, if I remember correctly, very late in the process. And once again, that is very conscious. When you are in the 4th and 5th drafts of a revision stage, and when you see what McCarthy's doing with these drafts, he is systematically adding them for a reason. And I think that reason is to create a contrast with the characters in nature, to, create this interplay with the supernatural, with kind of the more minimalistic elements, which is very smart. And this is actually present in all of his first 5 novels. In The Orchard Keeper, there are werecats. Yes, I said it, werecats. And this whole air of mysticism. In Outer Dark, there is the Triune. In Child of God, there's not so many, but that's because it was just quick make some money. It was a quick make some money novel. And then in Suttree, there are a bunch of shamanistic elements, multiple healers, and trips that Suttree goes on. And then 5th, in Blood Meridian, obviously Judge Holden is a supernatural character. And in every single one of those novels, all that stuff was added later. The early drafts of Blood Meridian, Judge Holden wasn't lifting a boulder above his head and walking around. And to go back to step number 1, McCarthy, for Child of God, was historically inspired by the Lula Lake murders, which were done by a guy named, I think, something Blevins, and this all happened A couple months before, McCarthy started writing Child of God. Obviously, Blood Meridian was inspired by Samuel Chamberlain's book, My Confessions. Suttree was inspired by his own life. Suttree is Cormac McCarthy, and when you read the early drafts, you can see that. And a lot of the other characters are are various friends that he had. And then in The Orchard Keeper, there are three main archetypes of the characters. First being this kind of innocent youth who's born into this new world of technology, which was Cormac McCarthy. It was basically John Wesley Ratner was the same age as him, and that was McCarthy's idolization of his youth. The second character being Marion Silder, who was pushing it back against the taxation of liquor by bootlegging. That was a common archetype. And then third is Arthur Omby, who is an old character who who can't really adapt to the new technological world. Those are three archetypes that McCarthy was very, I'm sure, familiar with through talking to other people. And then obviously because of what his dad did with the eminent domain of all those types of people, McCarthy had a lot of resentment and wanted to write that novel. All that wasn't unconscious. All that was conscious choices by McCarthy to include all that. And when you see how he argues with his editor about certain things, you would have to think like, wow, this isn't some unconscious, because if it was just some unconscious splurge, you'd be like, yeah, we can change that. That doesn't make sense. But he argues like, no, I put this in here specifically for this. And the reader should be able to figure this out. And they get in these long wars with each other over letters, sometimes for a year, over the course of years. So to review, step number one is find people or historical figures you know about. Second is write about them in a very loose way, providing a bunch of details about their past and feelings. Step number three is remove most of those feelings and create timeline issues or gaps in their past. And I didn't really talk about this as much, but a lot of Suttree, Outer Dark, The Orchard Keeper, and even Blood Meridian have a lot of like timeline issues and gaps and like a lot of wonky stuff happening with all that. And I think that kind of adds in to kind of the lack of interiority because we don't have kind of this linear character progression and characterization. Four is add some supernatural characters to create some symbolic contrast / interplay with the characters / nature. And then step number five is make nature a hidden character by adding a ton of great passages. Because why does McCarthy have all these random nature passages? Well, there is an idea out there about making setting a character. And that's what I really feel McCarthy does better than almost any other author. His use of nature makes it feel like it's important. Sometimes it's not even setting the mood. Sometimes it's very moody and it feels very good. But other times he just seems like he's writing landscape lines to write landscape passages. But that's because we have these empty characters on one side without any interiority. Then we have these supernatural elements that like really don't seem to fit. And what ties them all together? And that, of course, is nature. Because when you are out in nature, there really is no interiority because there's nothing for you to reflect off of. You can, go into your own headspace and daydream and all that. But when you're John Grady Cole or Cornelius Suttree living up in the mountains, at some level, you've freed yourself from interiority. But we once again don't see if these stories were taking place in New York City, in Manhattan, then it wouldn't really hit the same way. And then also in nature, there is an inherent creation of mysticism. For instance, werecats, shamanism, groups of weird men, hallucinations, like all the different things McCarthy's playing with are all things that happen out in nature. And you could say are common to the mythos of nature. People experiencing those types of things in a city are usually labeled as crazy. But cultures who experience those things indigenous cultures, we call that like holistic. So I think it's genius that McCarthy is adding this hidden character with nature because that is the unconscious, even though it's conscious. And I think a lot of those passages do come from an unconscious place and McCarthy really, feeling nature and like bringing that out. But that makes us unconsciously get roped into this little interplay that he does in almost every single novel. And then step number 6 is adding the italicized scenes, which is also very conscious. Excuse me. A lot of the time, the italicized stuff doesn't come until the later drafts, everyone. So all the dream sequences and all this stuff, it isn't like McCarthy sitting there like, oh my God, I'm channeling Melville and Hemingway. No, he's writing that as Cormac McCarthy, the nerdy writer who's on his 5th or 6th revision while working simultaneously on 4 different books during year number 5 or 6. And once again, I think that these are very conscious acts of creation because they're added later. And he argues with his editor time and time again about keeping these in and like why are they important and all of this. If they were just something that he wrote and it was a one-off and it had no structural integrity and didn't really mean anything, he would just say, "All right, let's get rid of them." But him and his editor, find problems or timeline issues or like gaps and all that, and like make it more digestible for us, which is once again a very conscious act. So now I kind of want to actually hop into the second half of his career. As I was talking about earlier, there are two different eras to McCarthy's writing career and how he approached his novels. So after Blood Meridian, as I've talked about on the show, I think McCarthy was fed up and he wanted to write more marketable novels. He had a young girlfriend, had some money for the first time in his life from the MacArthur Fellowship, which around now would be like being given $1 million or so. And I think he wanted to take all that take that lifestyle to the next level. So what was his plan? Well, he had written this screenplay, not Cities of the Plain, and he realized that he could take the two main characters, John Grady Cole and Billy Parham, and throw them into a series. Because what is better than a series? That's what you always hear about when publishers give advice to writers is if you write a series and it hits, then you make a bunch of money because people want to keep reading your books. And so with All the Pretty Horses, McCarthy writes his easiest novel with the most accessible writing, a love story, and all the other things, and achieves, overnight success, selling 200,000 copies in 6 months, which was a huge deal. But McCarthy then released the next novel in the series, The Crossing, only 2 years later. And The Crossing is a pretty big book. I think it's over 400 pages. And so when I look at the timeline, McCarthy actually wrote these two books very fast and then Cities of the Plain. And when we look at all the books other than The Passenger and Stella Maris during the second era of his career, which are the Border Trilogy, No Country for Old Men, and The Road, they were written at a much faster pace. Some just only took a couple years at most. And so, from what I can tell, I think that McCarthy, during the second era of his career, was much more unconscious with his character creation. And I think he did that because he knew that his massive talent was there. He just wrote Blood Meridian and Suttree. So he was like, wait, what if I just kind of stream of consciousness write about these simple characters and, walk them through this kind of basic storyline, and then in later drafts, add in a bunch of kind of the nature passages and kind of supernatural elements. And that's exactly what happened when you look at the first drafts of All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing. They aren't too complicated. It's really very simple writing that McCarthy enhances at a later date. And in The Crossing, McCarthy did try to write for a while from the point of view of the wolf, which was kind of a complicated affair. But then he abandoned that. I don't know if Blood Meridian McCarthy would abandon that. He said, you know what? I'm just going to make this work. I'm not going to turn this into the postmodern era because his postmodern books didn't sell very well. And when we look at The Road, he wrote the first draft apparently in a couple weeks. That is very unconscious. No Country for Old Men was once again a screenplay. The whole Border trilogy was built from a screenplay. No Country for Old Men was built from a screenplay. So from what I can tell, McCarthy was cruising during this era. Obviously, he was older. Obviously, he was involved with Santa Fe Institute and had a girlfriend in her 20s and had a kid with her. And I'm sure all that took a lot of time and energy away from him trying to create another Blood Meridian, which I'm sure, what I could tell, was a very taxing endeavor. But in the second half of his career with all these novels, he followed the exact same process, though. I don't know. I'm not going to act like I know where he got all these character ideas for the Border trilogy, other than it's just a simple Western story. Obviously, he was inspired to do The Road because of that experience he had, I think, in Ireland with his son. But most of these stories, once they get going, follow the same process. He removes emotion. He adds some supernatural stuff, like in The Crossing, adds a bunch of nature passages, and then, for instance, in No Country for Old Men, and then in The Road, he adds a lot of the dream sequences, and in The Crossing too, a lot of the italicized stuff in the kind of tail end of the later drafts. Because when you read the script of Cities of the Plain and No Country for Old Men, none of the dream sequence italicized stuff is in there. So, what do you guys think? What did you guys think of this process? Obviously, I wish I could tell you if McCarthy goes, went to the dictionary and got a name generator and how he figured out his characters. But I think I systematically proved where all the characters came from the first five novels. And then the latter five novels, I think were more inspired by just inspiration and McCarthy just trying to flow. And that's maybe why he said during the Oprah interview that his writing was unconscious, because The Road and No Country for Old Men was him just kind of riffing. But you can't tell me The Passenger, which he worked on for over 60 years, was a very unconscious novel, because unconscious novels don't take 60 years to complete. It's not like that book was, Finnegan's Wake or something. All right, so if you guys want to see more content, obviously subscribe to the channel. Check out my Blood Meridian t-shirts. I'm launching a whole new t-shirt website this week with like 30 new t-shirts. Obviously, we still got the Cormac McCarthy course going. Links down in the description below, and I will see you guys in the next video.